A reckless HOA Karen demanded I cut down all my trees to improve her view. Too bad for her, she instantly froze and went silent when I revealed I hold the logging permit for the entire county. The air shimmered with heat that afternoon, the kind that made the asphalt on Maple Grove Lane glisten like molten glass. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, until the sound of a chainsaw shattered the stillness. Birds scattered from the oak branches above, their wings slicing through the heavy air as the first buzz of metal teeth bit into bark. Ethan Ward stepped out onto his porch, his shadow cutting a long line across the sunlit lawn. He didn't move quickly. He didn't shout or wave his arms. Instead, he stood with deliberate calm, one hand resting on the porch railing, the other holding his phone loosely at his side. His century-old oak trees stood before him tall and steady, the same trees that had shaded the property long before Pine Ridge Estates had even been built. Their leaves rustled faintly in the summer wind, almost as if they could sense the danger. Two men in neon vests, contractors hired by the HOA, trudged across the yard, chainsaws humming in their hands. They looked uneasy, glancing at each other as if unsure they should be there. But the order had come from above, and no one in the neighborhood dared question the authority of Harold Crane, the HOA president. At the end of the street stood Harold himself, clipboard in hand, a smirk playing across his face. His short frame and neatly combed gray hair gave him the appearance of a polite retiree, but there was nothing kind in his eyes. He had the look of a man who enjoyed control, who found satisfaction in reminding others that he had it. His polished shoes barely touched the ground as he barked toward the workers. "Go ahead, cut them down. They're a violation of Section 4B of the Landscaping Code." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lifted his phone and aimed it toward the nearest worker. "Take 1 more inch," he said quietly, the calm in his tone cutting through the chainsaw's whine. "And you'll be shutting down every logging operation in this county." The chainsaw sputtered and went silent. The worker blinked, confusion flickering across his sunburned face. He looked from Ethan to Harold, then back again. The second man hesitated too, lowering his saw slightly. The silence that followed was almost electric. "What's that supposed to mean?" Harold called, his voice carrying across the street. He took a few steps forward, his expression hardening. "This is private HOA business, Mr. Ward. You don't have the authority to—" Ethan finally turned his gaze toward him. His eyes were steady, unflinching. "Authority?" he said, his voice calm but cold. "You might want to check who actually has it before you start cutting anything." For a brief moment, Harold hesitated. There was something in Ethan's tone, a quiet confidence that didn't fit the usual image of a nervous homeowner facing the HOA president. But then Harold chuckled, brushing off the feeling. "Nice try," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "These trees are overheight and obstructing street visibility. They're coming down today. If you have a problem, file a complaint like everyone else." Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned his phone screen toward Harold, revealing a live video feed already recording the entire scene. The contractors stiffened. One of them whispered under his breath, "He's filming." Harold's smirk faltered. "You can't record on HOA grounds without consent." "I'm standing on my property," Ethan replied smoothly, "and this is evidence." He stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. "See, Harold, before you send workers to touch someone's land, you might want to make sure you're not stepping into restricted jurisdiction." The contractors exchanged nervous glances. "Restricted?" one asked. Ethan nodded, his calm tone masking the storm brewing beneath it. "Every logging operation, every land clearance project in Redding Falls County, all of it runs through one license, mine." A ripple of disbelief crossed Harold's face, followed quickly by irritation. "That's ridiculous. You can't possibly—" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Would you like me to call the county office to confirm? Or should I let your workers finish cutting and let the Department of Environmental Compliance deal with the illegal activity later?" That did it. The workers stepped back, powering off their equipment entirely. "Sir," one of them said quietly to Harold, "we didn't know there was a permit issue." "There isn't," Harold snapped, his composure beginning to crack. "He's bluffing!" But Ethan could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. It wasn't fear yet, not quite, but it was the beginning of it. He could sense Harold's arrogance waver under the weight of something he couldn't control. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the air thick with tension. Then, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, low and ominous. It wasn't just the weather changing. Something deeper was shifting in Pine Ridge Estates. Finally, Harold straightened his clipboard, trying to regain his usual authority. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll pause this for now. But I'll be back with proper documentation." Ethan gave a faint smile, one that carried neither warmth nor fear. "You do that," he said, "and make sure your paperwork's real this time." Harold turned sharply and marched back toward his car, his shoes crunching against the gravel. The contractors lingered a moment longer, muttering apologies before following him. As the sound of engines faded down the road, Ethan exhaled slowly, his calm finally giving way to something darker, not anger, but resolve. He looked up at the towering oaks, their branches swaying lightly against the gray clouds gathering above. He knew this wasn't over. Harold Crane wasn't the type to back down. The man thrived on control, and having his authority challenged, especially in front of others, would only make him more dangerous. Ethan could already picture what was coming next. The fines, the fake notices, the endless harassment. But he was ready. Because Harold Crane had just picked a fight with the one man in the county who could legally shut him down. And he didn't even know it yet. Ethan turned back toward his porch, phone still recording, as a gust of wind swept through the trees. Their branches creaked, whispering against each other like a warning carried through the leaves. He paused at the top step, casting one last look toward the street where Harold's car had disappeared. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Then, almost too softly for anyone to hear, he whispered, "You'll wish you never touched those trees." The morning after the chainsaw incident, the streets of Pine Ridge Estates gleamed with their usual perfection. Lawns were clipped to regulation height, mailboxes gleamed in uniform beige, and every window curtain was a soft, neutral shade. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect from a distance, but the closer you got, the more you could feel the tension humming beneath its polished surface. Every smile carried a flicker of fear, every wave was measured, every conversation brief. And at the center of it all stood Harold Crane. He appeared that morning, as he always did, clipboard in hand, shirt neatly tucked, tie knotted as if he were attending a board meeting instead of patrolling suburban driveways. The neighborhood kids called him the Hawk, because no one escaped his watchful eye. He had been HOA president for nearly a decade, and in that time, Pine Ridge had transformed from a friendly cul-de-sac into his personal empire. Ethan Ward watched him from his front window, coffee mug in hand, as Harold paused across the street, jotting something on his clipboard. The man's movements were precise, sharp and practiced, like someone who'd spent his whole life writing people up for minor infractions. The faint creak of Harold's shoes on the pavement echoed across the manicured lawns. He stopped near Ethan's mailbox, squinting as if even the post number offended him. "Morning, Mr. Ward," Harold called, his tone a mix of politeness and condescension. "You're up early. Planning to do something about that unapproved lighting setup?" Ethan took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Morning, Harold. The lights are solar, low voltage, and within regulation wattage. They've been cleared by whom?" Harold asked, one eyebrow lifting. "By the city's building inspector." Ethan's voice remained calm, but his eyes held firm. Harold's smirk faltered for just a second. "Well, that may be," he said, scribbling on his clipboard anyway. "But they're not in the HOA design manual. You'll receive a notice with that." He turned sharply and walked on, already scanning the next yard. Ethan set his mug down and exhaled through his nose. He had seen men like Harold before, small men who needed power the way others needed air. But something about Harold Crane went beyond obsession. His control wasn't just about rules. It was about dominance. Over the following days, the pattern continued. A notice appeared on Ethan's door about his non-regulation mailbox post. Then another about unauthorized garden decor. One evening, he returned home to find a letter claiming his lawn edging was disrupting the visual flow of the street. Each fine came with the same threatening line: failure to comply may result in legal action or community penalties. At first, Ethan laughed it off, but by the third week, the notices became personal, One afternoon, he overheard two neighbors talking while walking their dogs. "Harold says that new guy's refusing to cooperate," one whispered. "Apparently, he's the reason the HOA fees might go up next quarter." Ethan stepped out onto his porch, pretending to check his mail. The men fell silent instantly, offering awkward smiles before walking away. He watched them go, jaw tightening. It was clear Harold had started spreading rumors. That evening, Ethan went through every letter, every clause in the HOA charter. It was a mountain of legal jargon, written in a way that kept residents too confused to fight back. But Ethan wasn't like most residents. Before moving to Pine Ridge, he had spent years managing environmental permits and legal filings, a profession that demanded precision and patience. Harold had chosen the wrong man to bully. The next morning, Ethan decided to confront him. He found Harold outside the community office, a modest brick building with a polished brass sign that read, Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Harold stood by the entrance, talking to two board members, his tone low and confident. As soon as he saw Ethan approaching, his smile tightened. "Mr. Ward," Harold said, "what brings you here?" Another complaint about the rules. "I'm not complaining," Ethan said evenly. "I'm clarifying. You've been issuing fines without proper documentation. According to HOA policy, any enforcement requires an inspection form signed by two board members, not just you." Harold blinked, surprised that Ethan knew the clause. "Well," he said, recovering, "that's a technicality. I have the authority to—" "You don't," Ethan interrupted, his tone still calm. "And if you continue without proper authorization, that's misuse of position." For a moment, Harold's face darkened. The board members shifted uncomfortably. But then he laughed softly. Not the kind of laugh that signaled amusement, but the kind that came from someone who thought he was untouchable. "Mr. Ward," he said, leaning closer, "you're new here. You don't understand how things work. This community values order. The residents trust me to keep things consistent." "Consistent?" Ethan asked. "You mean controlled?" Harold's eyes narrowed. "I suggest you choose your battles carefully," he said quietly. "I can make living here very unpleasant." Ethan met his stare. "You already have." He turned and walked away, leaving Harold standing in silence, his jaw clenched. From that day on, Harold's obsession grew darker. He began walking past Ethan's property more frequently, sometimes twice a day, sometimes at night. He would stop on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, pretending to write something down. Once, Ethan caught him photographing the trees from multiple angles, muttering to himself about obstructions and violations. Soon, other neighbors started receiving subtle warnings about associating with Ethan. "He's trouble," Harold would tell them. "Doesn't respect the rules." We can't let that kind of attitude spread. It worked, at least for a while. People who had once waved politely now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when Ethan passed. It was the kind of isolation Harold thrived on, the slow suffocation of social pressure. But then, Harold made a misstep. One afternoon, a new resident named Paul Hensley, who had recently joined the HOA board, stopped by Ethan's house. "I probably shouldn't be here," he admitted, glancing over his shoulder, "but I think you should know. Harold's been altering meeting records. I saw him remove a motion that was never approved. It was about your property." Ethan's expression didn't change, but his pulse quickened. "He's falsifying votes?" Paul nodded. "And signatures. He's been doing it for years." "Why tell me?" Ethan asked quietly. "Because he's going too far," Paul said. "He's planning to file an official removal order on your trees, says they're a hazard. But there's no hazard report. No inspection, nothing. He just wants them gone." Ethan leaned back in his chair, processing the information. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was fraud. And if Harold was manipulating board documents, there was no telling what else he'd forged. That night, Ethan retrieved his external hard drive and began backing up every interaction, every notice, every text and email exchange with Harold. He created folders by date, scanned letters, and stored digital copies of the HOA bylaws. The man wanted control. Fine. He'd get transparency instead. A week later, Harold struck again. A formal letter arrived. Immediate action required. Tree removal notice. It was signed by Harold and stamped with an official HOA seal. The problem was, Ethan recognized the seal. It was outdated, one that had been replaced 2 years ago. It was a fake. Ethan smiled faintly as he held the paper up to the light. The edges were slightly uneven, and the signature looked traced. He tucked it carefully into a folder and closed the drawer. He had everything he needed, and Harold had no idea he was walking straight into his own trap. From that point, Harold's behavior turned erratic. He began calling emergency meetings, pressuring board members to back his decisions, and even patrolling the neighborhood in the evenings with a flashlight, claiming he was ensuring compliance. Some neighbors found it amusing at first, but amusement turned to discomfort when Harold began stopping cars at night, demanding to know if they were residents. Ethan observed it all quietly, documenting each incident. He noticed how Harold's voice cracked when challenged, how his confident posture faltered when someone mentioned county oversight. The man's power was built on intimidation, not legitimacy. And once that illusion broke, it would all collapse. The breaking point came one windy afternoon when Harold once again stopped in front of Ethan's property. The wind tugged at his tie as he stared up at the towering oaks with barely concealed contempt. "Eyesore," he muttered under his breath. "Think you can defy me forever?" Ethan stood just inside the doorway, unseen, watching him. The sunlight caught the silver clip of Harold's pen as he scribbled another note on his clipboard. There was something almost tragic about him, a man who mistook control for respect, authority for purpose. Harold finally looked up, as if sensing he was being watched. Their eyes met for a brief second through the window, one filled with quiet defiance, the other with mounting desperation. Harold wasn't enforcing rules. He was feeding his ego. And he truly believed Ethan couldn't do a thing about it. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The sound of gravel crunching under his tires was the first sign that something was wrong. The protagonist slowed his truck as he turned onto his street, his eyes narrowing as bright splashes of color caught his attention through the windshield. It took only a moment for realization to strike. Giant, uneven X's painted in orange glared from the trunks of his oak trees like marks of execution. His chest tightened as he pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the yard. He stepped out slowly, heart pounding, a cold sense of disbelief mixing with the simmering anger that rose in his chest. The paint was still fresh. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, sharp and acrid. Whoever had done this had been there recently, maybe even within the hour. He walked closer, tracing a gloved hand along the rough bark. The trees had stood there for decades, their branches arching high above the street like a living canopy. They weren't just decoration. They were part of the land, part of the character of the home he'd built. And now they'd been marked for destruction. He didn't need to guess who was behind it. Harold Crane, the self-proclaimed guardian of Pine Ridge Estates. The man had made it his mission to find fault with everything. The mailbox, the paint color, the garden lights, and now apparently the trees. But this wasn't just another petty complaint. This was personal. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. There was no official notice posted anywhere, no paperwork taped to his door, no city authorization on display, nothing that would justify such a bold move. Yet the message was unmistakable. Harold wanted to make an example out of him. The following morning, he arrived at the HOA office to confront him. The building sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, neat, sterile, and almost empty except for Harold himself, who was standing behind the reception desk, flipping through a stack of violation reports like a judge reviewing crimes. His expression was smug, his gray hair slicked back, his shirt perfectly pressed. "Well, good morning," Harold said without looking up. "I was wondering when you'd come by." "What's the meaning of this?" the protagonist asked, dropping a photo of the spray-painted trees onto the counter. His voice was even but laced with tension. "You think vandalizing my property counts as enforcement?" Harold finally looked up, his lips curling into that infuriating half-smile. "Vandalizing? Hardly. The HOA board voted to remove those trees. They violate community height standards." "Really?" He crossed his arms. "Because I checked the bylaws. There's no height restriction on trees unless they block streetlights or pose a hazard." Mind you, neither Harold tapped the edge of the photo with his finger, unbothered. The board agreed they were obstructing visibility. It's a safety issue. I've already filed a report with the city. The protagonist walked out, fists clenched, anger burning low and cold. He knew there hadn't been any board meeting. Harold was the board, or at least he acted like it. The others were either too intimidated or too indifferent to challenge him. But this time, Harold had gone too far. 2 days later, the situation exploded. He came home early from work after a sudden meeting cancellation and froze at the sound of chainsaws. 3 men in neon vests stood near his driveway, ropes and equipment scattered around, their saws aimed at the base of his oaks. One of the trees already had a deep gash running across its trunk, the bark torn away in jagged lines. "Hey!" he shouted, rushing forward. The men stopped, startled. "What are you doing on my property?" The foreman, a stocky man with sunburned arms, looked confused. "We got a work order from the HOA," he said. "Said these trees were a hazard and needed to come down today." "Who signed the order?" The man hesitated. "A Harold Crane." "Does he have a city permit?" He said he did." The foreman rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly unsure. "Look, we're just following instructions." He pulled out his phone and snapped pictures of everything. The crew, the trucks, the half-cut tree. "Well, here's an instruction for you," he said evenly. "You touch another branch and I'll have you cited for illegal logging." These trees are protected under county regulation. You can tell Harold that the men exchanged uneasy glances. Within minutes, they packed up and left, mumbling apologies. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed every moment. The sound of chainsaws, Harold's smug tone, the fresh paint on the bark. It wasn't just about trees anymore. It was about control, about one man's belief that rules didn't apply to him. But Harold had made a mistake, a big one. Filing a false report with the city was a criminal offense, and if there was one thing the protagonist understood, it was paperwork. He worked in county environmental compliance, the very department responsible for issuing permits like the ones Harold had forged. That meant he had access to everything, the databases, the signatures, the timestamps. The next morning, he logged into the internal system and began to dig. Within minutes, the discrepancies started appearing. Harold had submitted a hazard report under a fabricated HOA letterhead, attaching what looked like an approval form from a city inspector. Only the signature didn't match any on file, not even close. It was a forgery. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Got you," he murmured. He printed everything, the falsified documents, the timestamps, the comparison signatures, and slid them neatly into a folder. But he didn't stop there. He began collecting every HOA notice Harold had sent him over the past months, cross-referencing dates, inspecting letterheads, and documenting inconsistencies. The pattern became clear. Harold had been abusing his position for years. When he arrived home that evening, Harold was there, standing at the edge of the driveway, clipboard in hand, pretending to measure the width of the sidewalk. "Evening," Harold said, glancing up with false politeness. "You might want to clear that debris by the curb." "It's a violation." He gave him a tight smile. "I'll make sure to file the proper paperwork." Something in his tone made Harold pause, but he quickly covered it with another smirk. "See that you do." As Harold walked away, the protagonist watched him, calm on the surface, but a storm brewing inside. Every word Harold spoke, every fake rule he enforced, was another nail in his own coffin. That weekend, the investigation deepened. A neighbor named Brian stopped by, nervously glancing over his shoulder. "You didn't hear this from me," he whispered. "But Harold's been using HOA funds to pay contractors off the books. My brother did landscaping for him. Got cash under the table, that was the missing piece. Financial misconduct. The protagonist began compiling records of HOA transactions, noticing strange withdrawals, duplicate invoices, and checks written to consultants who didn't exist. Each document brought him closer to the truth, and to the reckoning Harold had never seen coming. But even as he worked late into the night, one question lingered in his mind. How far would Harold go when cornered? The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, as he returned home, he noticed a city vehicle parked near his property. Two inspectors stood beside it, clipboards in hand. One of them approached him cautiously. "We received a complaint about unpermitted modifications to your front yard," the inspector said. He frowned. "From whom?" "HOA President Harold Crane. He said you installed illegal drainage systems." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Those systems were installed by the city 2 years ago. I was on the project team." The inspector blinked, realizing the situation. "Then we'll correct the record." As the truck drove away, he looked up at the orange marks on his trees, now faded by rain but still visible, a reminder of what Harold had started. The time for restraint was over. That night he sealed the final file and placed it in an envelope addressed to the state attorney's office. Every forgery, every lie, every false report was inside. Harold Crane had thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The plan had to be perfect. No missteps, no premature confrontation. For weeks, he lived a double life, the calm, compliant resident by day and the silent investigator by night. Harold Crane strutted through the neighborhood as usual, clipboard in hand, believing he still controlled everything within Pine Ridge Estates. But what Harold didn't realize was that every document he signed, every fine he issued, and every lie he uttered was quietly being documented, cataloged, and built into something far greater, a case that would dismantle his illusion of power once and for all. The mornings were the hardest. Each day, the protagonist would wake before dawn, sit at his kitchen table surrounded by manila folders and a flickering desk lamp, and sift through the growing pile of evidence. The air would be thick with tension, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. He logged every HOA notice Harold sent, every timestamp, every misused form, every official document that didn't match the county format. The deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. Harold wasn't just a tyrant, he was a thief. The first real break came from the neighbors. It started with one conversation, a quiet knock at his door late one evening. It was Mr. Jenkins from 2 streets over, a retired mechanic with grease-stained hands and a voice that trembled when he spoke. "I heard what happened with your trees," Jenkins said, glancing nervously toward the street as if Harold himself might appear. "He did the same thing to me last year. Fined me for having a non-approved fence color. Said I owed $600 or he'd take me to court." "Did he?" the protagonist asked, leaning forward. Jenkins shook his head. "No court. But the money disappeared. Never showed up in the HOA accounts. My wife checked over the next few days. More neighbors came forward. A young couple whose renovation project had been mysteriously denied. An elderly veteran who'd been fined for flying an American flag that wasn't community standard. Even a single father who'd been threatened with eviction over a parked work truck. Each story painted the same picture, a man obsessed with control and greed. Harold Crane wasn't protecting property values. He was lining his pockets. One night, the protagonist spread all the statements across his dining table, the papers overlapping like puzzle pieces. There were missing maintenance funds, unexplained consultant fees, and duplicate payments to a non-existent landscaping service. But one column stood out more than any other. Environmental maintenance, that was Harold's favorite phrase, and it appeared everywhere. He claimed it was for tree trimming, weed removal, and community upgrades. But there were no receipts, no invoices, nothing to show where the money went. He leaned back, staring at the numbers. "Environmental maintenance," he murmured. "That's my field." That's when the realization hit him, his true advantage, the one weapon Harold could never anticipate. As the county environmental compliance officer, he held the master logging permit for Redding Falls, a legal authorization that covered every environmental modification in the region, including Pine Ridge Estates. Every tree removal, every construction clearing, every single land alteration required his signature. Without it, no project could be approved, no crew could cut, and no permit could stand. He smiled faintly, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Harold had declared war in a battlefield the protagonist owned completely. From that point, everything changed. He began working quietly but methodically, reaching out to the county environmental board under the guise of a routine compliance check. He submitted a formal notice of irregular activity, unauthorized cutting within protected residential zones. The language was neutral, professional, impossible to trace back to personal motive, but he knew what it would trigger. A county-level audit. Within days, investigators began combing through the HOA's submitted paperwork. They didn't need long. Harold's fake permits failed the first stage of inspection. His forms were riddled with inconsistencies, falsified signatures, mismatched approval numbers, even the wrong formatting for official county documents. The board escalated the matter immediately, forwarding it to the county attorney's office for review. Meanwhile, Harold carried on as if nothing were happening. He continued issuing fines and making rounds, blissfully unaware that the trap was already closing around him. The protagonist watched from a distance, every move deliberate and patient. One morning, Harold made the mistake of pushing too far. He arrived at the protagonist's doorstep again, clipboard in hand, his smile wide and brittle. "Good morning," he said in that falsely polite tone that always carried a hint of threat. "I noticed your garbage bins were left out past the allowable collection window. That's another fine." The protagonist met his gaze calmly. "You sure you want to add that to your list right now, Harold?" Harold blinked, thrown off by the quiet confidence in the man's voice. "Excuse me?" "Let's just say there's been a lot of talk around the neighborhood," he replied, crossing his arms. "People comparing notes about your management style." Harold's expression hardened, though his voice remained smooth. "I'm simply doing my duty." "Some of us still care about maintaining standards." "Oh, I care about standards," the protagonist said softly. "Just not the kind that involve forged signatures." For the first time, Harold faltered. His pen froze midair and a thin line of ink dripped onto the page. "What did you just say?" But the protagonist simply smiled and stepped back inside, leaving Harold standing on the porch, his confidence cracked for the first time. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet whispers. People had started talking openly, comparing old notices, discussing fines that had never been properly documented. A current of rebellion ran through Pine Ridge Estates. The once intimidated residents were beginning to see Harold for who he really was. The following week, a white county vehicle appeared near the HOA office. Two inspectors stepped out, carrying clipboards and thick binders. They spent hours inside, reviewing files, collecting statements, and taking photographs. By sunset, they left with boxes full of documents, evidence that would soon reach the state's investigators. But the protagonist wasn't done. He wanted to make sure Harold's downfall wasn't just legal, it was public. Late one night, he drafted a summary report of his findings, a clean, professional document outlining Harold's violations, backed by copies of every falsified form and financial discrepancy. He attached a short note to the top. For immediate review, unauthorized environmental activities under HOA jurisdiction. He sent it directly to the County Environmental Board's director, his supervisor, knowing that by morning, the entire chain of command would be aware. The next day, Harold called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers appeared on every doorstep, summoning residents to the community hall. When the protagonist arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Dozens of neighbors sat in folding chairs, whispering among themselves as Harold took the stage, his face pale but his voice defiant. "There have been rumors circulating," Harold began, tapping his clipboard against the podium. "False accusations about this association's integrity. Let me assure you everything is in perfect order." From the back of the room, the protagonist raised his hand. "Then you won't mind answering a question." Harold stiffened. "Go ahead." "Who authorized the tree removals last month?" "The board did," Harold said quickly. "Then why?" the protagonist asked, stepping forward and holding up a document. "Does the county database show no record of a valid permit? And why is your signature on a forged approval form?" Gasps rippled through the room. Harold's eyes darted from face to face, searching for support, but none came. The protagonist laid the document on the podium. "The County Environmental Board has already launched an investigation. And just so you know, falsifying a government signature carries a penalty of up to 5 years in prison." For the first time, Harold's confidence broke completely. He stammered, You can't—" "Oh, but I can," the protagonist interrupted quietly. "Because that permit you forged? It falls under my jurisdiction. I'm the master permit holder for Redding Falls." The silence that followed was absolute. Harold's clipboard slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. Within an hour, the meeting dispersed in chaos. Residents demanding explanations, others shouting for Harold's resignation. He tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. His empire of paper and fear had collapsed. Back home, the protagonist sat at his desk once more, the soft hum of his computer filling the room as he finalized his report for the county. He didn't need to celebrate or gloat. The truth was already working its way through the system, and soon enough the consequences would follow. He closed the final folder, his expression calm but resolute. The trap had been set, and Harold Crane was already caught in it. The morning of the HOA's annual meeting arrived gray and heavy, the air thick with anticipation. For weeks, rumors had rippled through Pine Ridge Estates, whispers of investigations, forged documents, and missing funds. Neighbors who once feared Harold Crane now eyed him with suspicion. Still, Harold seemed determined to put on a show of strength. By 10 o'clock, he stood at the front of the crowded community hall, the golden HOA emblem gleaming on the podium beside him, as if authority alone could shield him from the truth that was about to crash down around him. He adjusted his tie twice before speaking, his voice booming over the microphone. "Welcome, residents of Pine Ridge Estates," he began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've had an incredible year maintaining the beauty and order of our community. Together, we've kept this neighborhood one of the most desirable in all of Redding Falls County." Scattered applause followed, polite but hollow. The protagonist, Mr. Dalton, watched from the back of the room, silent, calm, his folder resting on his lap. Harold's words rolled over the crowd, full of self-congratulation and empty promises. It was a performance, and everyone knew it. "Now," Harold continued, flipping through his notes, "before we move to budget proposals, I'd like to thank those who supported recent landscaping efforts. It wasn't easy making tough decisions about tree removals and property regulations, but we did what was necessary to protect everyone's property values." That line hung in the air like a dare. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. From his seat, Dalton's gaze hardened. There it is, he thought. The arrogance. The last act before the curtain falls. He stood up slowly. Heads turned as the chair legs scraped against the tile. Harold's eyes caught his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of unease. "Mr. Dalton," Harold said, the microphone amplifying the faint tremor in his voice, "you're not on the agenda." Dalton walked down the center aisle, calm and steady, the sound of his footsteps echoing across the room. "You'll want to make room," he said quietly, though his words carried. He reached the front, setting a thick folder and a small USB drive on the podium. Harold tried to maintain his composure. "This isn't the time for personal grievances," he said, forcing a smile toward the crowd. "Let's stick to—" Dalton interrupted, his tone measured. "This isn't about grievances. It's about truth." A murmur spread across the hall. The treasurer leaned forward in his chair, frowning. "What's this about, Dalton?" Without answering, Dalton connected his laptop to the projector. The lights dimmed, and the first slide appeared on the screen, a scan of an official county document. "This," Dalton said, his voice cutting through the silence, "is a permit request filed by Mr. Harold Crane for tree removal operations in Pine Ridge Estates. Note the signature." The signature at the bottom, bold and confident, read Michael Dalton, County Logging Permit Officer. Gasps rippled through the audience. Harold took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "That's your name," the treasurer said, confused. "But why would Harold be using it?" Dalton clicked again. The next slide displayed the same document. Only this time, the digital signature metadata glowed in red. "Because he forged it," Dalton said. "This document was submitted without my authorization, using a falsified approval stamp. Every single tree removal and construction project under his direction was illegal." Harold's face turned pale. "That's absurd," he stammered, his voice cracking. "This man has a personal vendetta." Dalton's next click silenced him. The projector flickered to a video file, a recording captured from one of the contractor's body cams. On screen, Harold's voice rang out clearly. "Don't worry about permits. I have authorization. Just start cutting before anyone from the county shows up." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. A neighbor in the front row whispered, "That's his voice." Harold lunged toward the laptop. "This is out of context! You can't—" "Sit down, Harold," Dalton said firmly. The calm in his tone had the weight of authority, and for the first time Harold obeyed, trembling as he lowered himself into the chair beside the podium. Dalton turned back to the crowd. Over the last month, I've gathered documentation of every violation, every falsified form, and every missing dollar from HOA accounts. You all deserve to know where your fees have been going. The next series of slides showed spreadsheets, account transfers, and unauthorized maintenance payments, all leading back to Harold's personal bank account. The treasurer's face went white. "Those were community funds," he muttered. "You said it was for landscaping upkeep." Harold tried to speak, but his voice failed. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I can explain." Dalton turned one last time to the screen. And finally, the official confirmation from the County Environmental Board. The final document appeared, stamped and signed in red ink. Logging permit holder. Redding Falls County, Michael Dalton. He faced Harold directly. "Every illegal tree you touched was under my jurisdiction," he said evenly, "and every signature you forged is now part of a federal fraud investigation." The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. Neighbors stood, shouting questions and accusations. Someone yelled, "You lied to us!" Another voice cut through the noise. "You made me pay fines for flowers!" The treasurer rose shakily to his feet. "Effective immediately, I resign," he said, tossing his badge onto the table. He turned toward Harold. "You're finished." Harold's hands trembled as he tried to gather his papers. This can't be." But before he could finish, the double doors at the back of the hall opened. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by a man in a brown jacket, the county environmental inspector. The entire room fell silent as the inspector approached the podium. "Mr. Harold Crane?" he said, his tone professional but firm. Harold froze, his face drained of color. "Yes? You're under arrest for falsifying county permits, embezzlement of HOA funds, and illegal environmental alterations. You'll need to come with us." Harold stumbled backward. "This is a mistake. You don't understand." The inspector nodded to the officers. "We understand perfectly." As they placed cuffs on Harold's wrists, he looked around the room, searching for anyone who might still believe him. But every face was turned away. The same neighbors he'd bullied, fined, and humiliated now stared in silent satisfaction. Dalton stood at the side of the room, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Harold met his gaze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You did this," he hissed. Dalton nodded once. "No, Harold. You did this to yourself." The officers led Harold toward the exit. Cameras flashed. Several residents had pulled out their phones, recording the moment that would become neighborhood legend. The once proud HOA president, dragged out in handcuffs, his empire of fear collapsing behind him. Outside, the morning sunlight spilled through the open doors, catching on Harold's metal cuffs as he was escorted into the waiting car. The crowd followed him to the edge of the parking lot, their murmurs growing into open applause. The inspector turned to Dalton as he packed up his laptop. "You handled this by the book," he said quietly. "Most people would have lost their temper long before this point." Dalton gave a faint smile. "There's no point in shouting when the truth speaks louder." As the sirens faded down the street, the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation. Neighbors approached Dalton, shaking his hand, thanking him, offering apologies for not seeing through Harold sooner. For the first time in years, Pine Ridge Estates felt like a community again, not a dictatorship. Dalton gathered his things and took one last look at the podium where Harold had stood, so sure of his power just an hour ago. The microphone still hung slightly askew, the papers scattered like remnants of a toppled kingdom. He stepped outside, the breeze cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the trees that still stood tall, untouched, protected, and now symbols of quiet victory. He didn't smile, but there was a calm satisfaction in his expression. Justice didn't need celebration. It only needed to be done. And as he walked down the sunlit path toward home, the sound of applause still echoing faintly behind him, he thought to himself that Harold Crane's story was over, written not by power, but by truth. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of bureaucratic power, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that petty control can lead to unexpected and devastating professional repercussions.